Good morning. Happy Monday. So today is our fresh start. We're starting Number the Stars, and I'm doing these lessons a little differently. I'm doing them in a Zoom of one and recording it so that I'll be able to share my screen with you and have the text and me in the screen. So that way I get to stay connected to you, you get to see me, and we can kind of read it along together. So we're going to do basically a chapter a day, and the chapters are much shorter than Redfern. So we'll have time to do a little bit more with the text. And one of the things I want to do with the text is practicing using our context clues, which is something that we've done, but a skill that we definitely need to build on. So many times when you're reading to yourself, if there's a word that you come across that you don't know, you just slide past it. And that can really change the meaning of the text. So we're going to talk about when you come upon those words and different strategies in order to do it. So right now I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you a few words from chapter 1 in Number the Stars. So hopefully this is working right and you can see my screen. And let's look at a couple of these. So from chapter 1, one of the first sentences is, she was a stocky 10-year-old girl, unlike lanky Anne-Marie. So when we see this and we see the word unlike lanky Anne-Marie, we know whatever stocky is, it's the opposite of lanky. That doesn't help us too much if you don't know what lanky means, but I think we've had that vocabulary word in the past. Lanky is kind of like thin and almost spaghetti-like. And so stocky is more shorter and broader. So lanky is kind of tall and very thin, and stocky is shorter, and maybe we also equate it with being a little more muscular. So it's not necessarily, you know, that they're large people, but they're solid. Let's see. Stocky means broad and sturdily built. Yep. Our next word that we're going to come across in chapter 1 is contempt. His Danish was very poor. This is the language that he spoke. 3 years, Anne-Marie thought with contempt, and she's talking about the Nazi soldiers. 3 years they've been in our country and they still can't speak our language. So she's annoyed by this. And so she's thinking with contempt. So it's an emotion. So if you have an emotion of that, it's thinking a person or thing is beneath you or worthless. Like, seriously, 3 years they've been here and they can't speak our language. That's kind of that contempt, like, ugh, awful. Obstinate is a word that I love, and we have had that one in the past. This is definitely a word that you could be using in your writing. Stand still, Kirsty, Anne-Marie ordered silently. So kind of like, you know, saying in her mind, praying that somehow the obstinate 5-year-old would receive the message. So she's telling her to stay silent, and she's praying that this little girl receives it. Not totally a lot of clues there, but we know that this isn't necessarily a positive word. So if somebody's obstinate, it means they're stubborn. They refuse to change their opinions or actions. She's standing her ground. And when we come to that word in the text, there's more context around it too. But now you'll recognize obstinate is somebody who's stubborn. So you could substitute in there, a stubborn 5-year-old would receive the message. I want to do this, I'm going to do this kind of kid. And here's the last word for today. She glanced through the window down to the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces impassive beneath the helmets. So I want you to think about a soldier underneath a helmet, and they're kind of just standing on the street. And you may have heard the word passive before. So this has a prefix in front of it that puts it to the kind of the opposite. So impassive means not feeling or showing emotion. So if you're impassive, you don't show any emotion. So there you go. All right, so I'm going to get out of this and close this down and enlarge in the text to be full screen. So we're going to go through and we're going to read chapter 1 together. As of this point, you have a lot of background information from Mrs. Jacobson about what Nazi-occupied Denmark looked like during the time of World War II. So I will also put in here the text of this book on the assignment, and bring your sharing is paused. Bring your shared window to the front. All right, how do I do that? Resume share. Okay, so let me pull this up. Hopefully when I play this back, this worked. New shared window to the front. I think I might have to close out the PowerPoint maybe. I gotcha. Okay, change your stops. Okay, so give me 1 second with this. I apologize as I kind of work out these kinks, and I will share the screen now. Yeah. Okay, so why are you running? I'll race you to the corner, Ellen. Anne-Marie adjusted the thick leather pack on her back so that her school books balanced evenly. Ready? She looked at her best friend. Ellen made a face. No, she said, laughing. You know I can't beat you. My legs aren't as long. Can't we just walk like civilized people? She was a stocky 10-year-old, unlike lanky Anne-Marie. We have to practice for the athletic meet on Friday. I know I'm going to win the girls' race this week. I was second last week, but I've been practicing every day. Come on, Ellen, Anne-Marie pleaded, eyeing the distance to the next corner of the Copenhagen street. Please? Ellen hesitated, then nodded and shifted her own rucksack of books against her shoulders. Oh, all right, ready, she said. Go, shouted Anne-Marie, and the two girls were off, racing along the residential sidewalk. Anne-Marie's silvery blonde hair flew behind her, and Ellen's dark pigtails bounced against her shoulders. Wait for me, wailed little Kirsty, left behind, but the two older girls weren't listening. Anne-Marie outdistanced her friend quickly, even though one of her shoes came untied as she sped along the street called Ostra Brigade. So that little O with the slash in it, because this is a street in Denmark, Danish, that's part of their alphabet and how they write their letter O. Past the small shops and cafes of her neighborhood, here in northeast Copenhagen. Laughing, she skirted an elderly lady in black who carried a shopping bag made of string. A young woman pushing a baby in a carriage moved aside to make way. The corner was just ahead. Anne-Marie looked up, panting, as she reached the corner. Her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Halt! The soldier ordered in a stern voice. The German word was as familiar as it was frightening. Anne-Marie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Kirsty was plodding along, her face in a pout, because the girls hadn't waited for her. Anne-Marie stared up. There were two of them. That meant two helmets, two set of cold eyes glaring at her, and four tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking her path to home. And it meant two rifles gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first, then finally she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. Why are you running? The harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Anne-Marie thought with contempt. 3 years, and they've been in our country, and they still can't speak our language. That was our other vocabulary word. So she's very kind of disgusted by these soldiers that, as you've learned in social studies, are occupying the streets of Denmark. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go about what that meant and what was happening there. but that they're not at war with Denmark, but they're making their presence known, and they are showing off their power as it goes. So far we've met 3 characters. So Ellen Rosen, and we find this out in more detail later, but she is a young Jewish girl living in Denmark, and she is kind of darker haired and stocky. And her best friend, Anne-Marie Johansson, who is Danish and kind of taller and blonder and lighter. And with what you've learned, we'll be learning in social studies, a lot of the ways that you can kind of pick up on different people's, nationalities sometimes is their appearance, their skin tone, their hair color, their eye color. I'm Italian, so certainly don't be fooled by, you can see my roots coming in now. My hair is darker, my eyes are darker. The part of Italy that my family is from, we all look kind of similar. You look at old pictures, we call them the Roman noses, and it's kind of similar. So a lot of times it was just a red flag that someone was Jewish just based on their appearance. So they'll always kind of look at Ellen a little differently than the blonde Anne-Marie Johansson. I was racing with my friend, she answered politely. We have races at school every Friday, and I want to do well, so Her voice trailed away, the sentence unfinished. Don't talk so much, she told herself. Just answer them, that's all. She glanced back at Ellen, who was motionless on the sidewalk a few yards behind her. Farther back, Kirsty was still sulking and walking toward the corner. Nearby, a woman had come to the doorway of a shop and was standing silently watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved toward her. Anne-Marie recognized him as the one she and Ellen always called in whispers the giraffe, because of his height and his long neck that extended from his stiff collar. He and his partner were always on this corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Anne-Marie trembled. What is in here? He asked loudly from the corner of her eye. She saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of the doorway out of sight. Obviously, nothing this shopkeeper had been doing, but, kind of just wanting to get away from the scene. School book, she answered truthfully. Are you a good student? The soldier asked. He seemed to be sneering. So a sneer is kind of like oof. Are you a good student? Yes. What's your name? Anne-Marie Johansson. Your friend, is she a good student too? He was looking beyond her at Ellen, who hadn't moved. Anne-Marie looked back too and saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was pale, and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. Better than me, she said. What is her name? Ellen. And who is this? He asked, looking to Anne-Marie's side. Kirsty had appeared in there suddenly, scowling at everyone. My little sister. She reached down for Kirsty's hand, but Kirsty, always stubborn, refused it and put her hands on her hips defiantly. The soldier reached down and stroked her sister's short, tangled curls. Stand still, Kirsty, Anne-Marie ordered, silently praying that somehow the obstinate, or vocab word, stubborn, 5-year-old would receive the message. But Kirsty reached up and pushed the soldier's hand away. Don't, she said loudly. Both soldiers began to laugh. They spoke to each other in rapid German that Anne-Marie couldn't understand. She is pretty like my own little girl, the tall one said in a more pleasant voice. Anne-Marie tried to smile politely. Go home, all of you. Go study your school books and don't run. You look like hoodlums when you run. That's kind of an old-fashioned word that my grandmother used to use. It means just kind of like punks or bad kids. The 2 soldiers turned away. Quickly, Anne-Marie reached down again and grabbed her sister's hand before Kirsty could resist. Hurrying the little girl along, she rounded the corner. In a moment, Ellen was beside her. They walked quickly, not speaking, with Kirsty between them, toward the large apartment building where both families lived. When they were almost home, Ellen whispered suddenly, I was so scared. Me too, Anne-Marie whispered back. As they turned to enter their building, both girls looked straight ahead toward the door. They did it purposefully, so that the soldiers would not catch the eyes or the attention of 2 more soldiers, who stood with their guns on this corner as well. So how intimidating to have soldiers sitting in the corner of your street. And keep in mind, these are regular towns and cities like we have in Boston and in Mattapoisett and suburbs. to have soldiers on the corner with guns. Just very intimidating. Kirsty scurried ahead of them through the door, chattering about the picture she was bringing home from kindergarten to show Mama. For Kirsty, the soldiers were simply part of the landscape, something that had always been there on every corner, as unimportant as lampposts throughout her remembered life. Are you going to tell your mother? Ellen asked Anne-Marie as they trudged together up the stairs. I'm not. My mother would be upset. No, I won't either. Mama would probably scold me for running on the street, because running just brings attention to yourself. She said goodbye to Ellen on the second floor where Ellen lived and continued on to the third, practicing in her mind a cheerful greeting for her mother, a smile, a description of today's spelling test in which she had done well. But she was too late. Kirsty had gotten there first. And he poked Anne-Marie's book bag with his gun, and then he grabbed my hair. Kirsty was chattering as she took off her sweater in the center of the apartment living room. But I wasn't scared. Anne-Marie was, and Ellen too, but not me. Mrs. Johansson rose quickly. Sorry, I can't see that. Oh, there you go. From the chair by the window where she'd been sitting. Mrs. Rose and Ellen's mother was there too, in the opposite chair. They'd been having coffee together, as they did many afternoons. Of course, it wasn't really coffee, though the mothers still called that having coffee. There had been no real coffee in Copenhagen since the beginning of Nazi occupation, not even any real tea. The mothers sipped at hot water flavored with herbs. Anne-Marie, what happened? What is Kirsty talking about? Her mother asked anxiously. Where's Ellen? Mrs. Rosen had a frightened look. Because again, the Rosens are Jewish, so they're even more in heightened alert and frightened for what the Nazis could do to them. Ellen's in your apartment. She didn't realize you were here, Anne-Marie explained. Don't worry, it wasn't anything. It was the two soldiers who stand on the corner of Oster Brigade. You've seen them, you know, the tall one with the long neck, the one who looks like a silly giraffe. She told her mother and Mrs. Rosen of the incident, trying to make it sound humorous and unimportant, but their uneasy looks didn't change. I slapped his hand and shouted at him, Kirsty announced importantly. You could see why that would make a mother nervous or unhappy. No, she didn't, Mama, Anne-Marie reassured her mother. She's exaggerating, as she always does. Mrs. Johansson moved to the window and looked down to the street below. The Copenhagen neighborhood was quiet. It looked the same as always. People coming and going from the shops, children at play, the soldiers on the corner. She spoke in a low voice to Ellen's mother. They must be edgy because of the latest resistance incidents. Did you read in De Vrij Dansk about the bombings in Hillerød and Nørrebro? Although she pretended to be absorbed in unpacking her school books, Anne-Marie listened, and she knew what her mother was referring to. De Vrij Dansk, the Free Danes, was an illegal newspaper. Peter Nielsen brought it to them occasionally, carefully folded and hidden among ordinary books and papers. And Mama always burned it after she and Papa had read it. But Anne-Marie heard Mama and Papa talk, sometimes at night, about the news they received that way. News of sabotage against the Nazis, bombs hidden and exploded in the factories that produced war materials, and industrial railroad lines damaged so that the goods could not be transported. So I imagine in social studies, you'll be talking about sabotage and things that these groups who couldn't openly go to war with the Germans because the Germans had such a massive army were able to do. And she knew what resistance meant. Papa had explained. When she overheard the word and asked, the resistance fighters were Danish people, no one knew who because they were very secret, who were determined to bring harm to the Nazis however they could. They damaged the German trucks and cars and bombed their factories. They were very brave. Sometimes they were caught and killed. I must go and speak to Ellen, Mrs. Rosen said, moving toward the door. You girls walk a different way to school tomorrow. Promise me, Anne-Marie. And Ellen will promise too. Again, you don't want to catch the eye of these Nazi soldiers. You don't want them to recognize you or know you. We will, Mrs. Rosen. But what does it matter? There are German soldiers on every corner. They will remember your faces, Mrs. Rosen said, turning in the doorway to the hall. It is important to be one of the crowd, always. Be one of the many. Be sure that they never have reason to remember your face. She disappeared into the hall and closed the door behind her. He'll remember my face, Mama, Kirsty announced happily, because he said I look like his little girl. He said I was pretty. Again, she's only 5, so there's no way she's grasping what this means. If he is such a pretty little girl, why doesn't he go back to her like a good father? Mrs. Johansson murmured, stroking Kirsty's cheek. Why doesn't he go back to his own country? Mama, is there anything to eat? Anne-Marie asked, hoping to take her mother's mind away from the soldiers. Take some bread and give a piece to your sister. With butter? Kirsty asked hopefully. No butter, her mother replied. You know that. Kirsty sighed as Anne-Marie went to the bread box in the kitchen. I wish I could have a cupcake, she said. A big yellow cupcake with pink frosting. Her mother laughed. For a little girl, you have a long memory, she told Kirsty. There hasn't been any butter or sugar or cupcakes for a long time. A year at least. When will there be cupcakes again? When the war ends, Mrs. Johansson said. She glanced through the window down to the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces impassive beneath the metal helmets. When the soldiers leave. So everything's kind of being rationed, and that's also part of like a control issue. And don't forget, all this food now also needs to go and feed the German soldiers. So that's something that's kind of happening here too, and I'm sure you'll discuss that. So great day, chapter 1. Check back here tomorrow, and we'll keep going, do a few more vocab words. And as we learn to develop these characters, it will seem, it will go a little easier. All right, I hope all is well, and I will talk to you soon. Take care.